People of the book, hello and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Mayor and Festival founder Judd Ashman, your host for this evening's GBF presentation. Before we get started, a quick plug to support tonight's authors by purchasing their books, not from just anywhere, but from our wonderful bookseller partners at Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. We have links to the books in the description, and I'll note that given all we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local jobs and the local economy. More on that later. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Now let's get started. Today we have with us Jeanine Cummins, author of the #1 New York Times bestselling novel, American Dirt, which was both an Oprah Book Club and Barnes & Noble Book Club selection. The novel has been translated into nearly 40 languages and has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide. It was one of the top 10 best-selling novels of 2020. Also noteworthy, Jeanine is a Gaithersburg native whose family has had a profound impact on our community, including in service to our large immigrant population. She's a proud graduate of Gaithersburg High School and a good friend of our festival. We root for her success and are delighted to welcome her back. Jeanine will be in conversation with Maureen Corrigan, the award-winning book critic on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Ms. Corrigan is a terrific author in her own right. Our community may recall Maureen was with us at GBF a few years ago to speak about her book, So We Read On, How the Great Gatsby Came to Be and Why It Endures. She's also a college professor and a panel judge for some of literature's top prizes. As I turn it over to Maureen and Jeanine, the only regret I have is that we're not doing this in person. Hopefully we'll soon be done with this pandemic and all others forever, and we get to host you both on site in the near future. For now, big welcome to Jeanine Cummins and Maureen Corrigan.
Thank you so much, Judd. And I like your optimism. Jeanine, it's a real pleasure to sort of meet you. I wish we could break through these Zoom panels and actually be in person, but it is lovely to be able to talk with you about American Dirt as a novel and as a phenomenon. I wanted to start by asking you what this last year and a half or so has been like for you. I imagine that, like most of us, you've been pretty sequestered, which means that perhaps you've been a little bit more removed from the outcry that greeted American Dirt after its publication. And I wonder if, in a way, the pandemic has allowed you to have some perspective on everything that happened after the novel came out.
Yeah, well, first, hello, thank you for being here. It's really lovely to meet you, and I'm so happy that we get to do it in my hometown book festival. Yeah. So it's a big question to begin with, and I would say in some ways, on the contrary, being sequestered, being secluded in my home during this pandemic, I think has made what happened with American Dirt in some ways more difficult, because I didn't have the opportunity as much to be out in the world and gain the perspective that I think I needed. And it took me a long time. It's been 14 or 15 months since the novel came out, and it's been quite a journey. It's been a work in progress as far as learning how to understand what happened surrounding the publication. And I'm still figuring it out. It was a very multi-layered response to the book. And yet I think the media narrative about that response was hyper simplified in a way that caused a lot of cognitive dissonance for me, until I was able to take some time to unpack it and start peeling back some of the layers individually and learning how to separate the responses, figuring out which ones felt really legitimate and which ones felt like they were just incredibly personal and unfair. And to be sure, those responses existed on both sides, and everything in between. So the pandemic, I think, it's been really difficult on writers in some ways. In other ways, it's been a boon for writers because I can do so many events without having to leave my kids and my family, without having to travel. And that has been great. I've visited many book clubs this year. That's been wonderful. It's been a great experience, largely. And, just as a human being, I think the pandemic gives us perspective on everything. It was my hope in the beginning that it might be a moment sort of globally where we might remember that ultimately we're all the same. None of us are immune from humanity. We don't get to opt out. We are all linked in these fundamental ways. And it's been a real crazy year with all of the sort of global reckoning that's happening on really important subjects, on racial justice and social justice, in the middle of the pandemic, and also sort of hand in hand with a culture that is in some ways sort of increasingly intolerant. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot.
A lot, yeah. And there's so much in what you've just said. One of the sentences that you have in American Dirt that stays with me is when Lydia, your main character, and I do want to talk about the book and not just the phenomenon. So we'll get to her, but she says something about trauma needing silence to really have an impact. And without making a false comparison between what Lydia goes through in the book and what you have been through, I feel like as an author, you have been through a somewhat traumatic experience, and how you've described your life during the pandemic makes me think about the silence that this pandemic has imposed upon us, perhaps, allowing you to really take in and feel all the criticism that was leveled at you and the book, some of it fair, some of it totally not fair and ad hominem. I think it's so rare for a novel to be such a lightning rod for so many things. And certainly that is part of the phenomenon that American Dirt has become. And I doubt there's anyone who's listening to us who hasn't heard some of this. But perhaps to really lightly recap, I first heard about American Dirt from booksellers who I trust, who said to me, oh, this is coming out, I think in January of last year, and you've got to read this book. This is going to be a big book. You've got to read this book. And booksellers I trust. I get probably about 30, 40 emails from publicists a day, some of whom I trust, most of whom I don't. But booksellers I trust. And so I started reading American Dirt, and I saw the incredible blurbs that here's my edition, my review edition: Stephen King, Sandra Cisneros, Don Winslow, Ann Patchett, Kristen Hanna, Julia Alvarez, John Grisham, a variety of authors. Just couldn't say enough good things about this book. And I started reading it, and I was completely drawn in, and couldn't put it down. But shortly after publication, and shortly after I wrote a very positive review and presented it on Fresh Air, there began to be a backlash. Critics said that you misused, Latinx terms, that you were almost being kind of a tourist, that you were a voyeur to this culture of Mexican migrants and migrants from Central America. And they also took issue with your afterword, where you said you wanted to individuate the so-called brown masses and almost act as a bridge with your writing to a larger audience. And I think, of course, by that, we also mean people like me, white readers. And then there was also some aesthetic criticism of the book as well. And you've already kind of nodded to this, but it almost seems like American Dirt intersected with a certain moment in our history, especially in the United States, where we are talking about racial justice, we're talking about cultural appropriation. And it's like the Titanic and the iceberg. This book met the moment, and there you were. I wonder if you would do us the favor of just giving us a taste of what it was like to be you when this response began to build, this negative response began to build.
You know, it's a difficult thing to talk about in balance, because I am not a victim, and I don't want to ever portray myself as a victim. I'm a writer, I'm a novelist, I wrote a book I believe in. Yeah. I have had real trauma in my life before this moment, more than once. And that has a bearing on my voice as a writer. It has a bearing on the topics that I choose to write about. It has a bearing on the things that I care enough to write about. And absolutely, it influences my work and my voice and my humanity, how I see the world. So, you know, the response and being the person who I am in the midst of that response was incredibly painful, but it's also difficult to sort of say that without inviting further criticism of me trying to portray myself as a victim, which I am not. You know, I can just say it felt like grief. You know, I spent 5 years writing this book. I did a tremendous amount of research. I traveled to Mexico. I visited migrant shelters. I visited orphanages. I volunteered at a desayunador, which is like a soup kitchen for migrants. I spoke to everyone I could find who knew a lot more about this subject than I did. Everyone from the lawyers who are doing the pro bono legal work of representing unaccompanied kids, to the men and women running the shelters, humanitarian aid workers, scholars, and of course, countless migrants themselves on various stages of their journeys. And throughout the process of that 5 years of research, I was afraid of writing this novel. You know, my first draft was set in the borderlands. It was not set in Mexico. Mm. And the reason that was true was because I didn't want to write a book set in Mexico. I felt a little nervous, a lot nervous about that, if I'm being honest. And then I was doing this research, and over again, I met people who were doing incredibly heroic work, who were undertaking incredibly heroic journeys. And I felt confronted by my own cowardice over and over again. And I thought, like, how absurd is it to be afraid of writing a novel? Mm-hmm. And yet I maintained that fear for a long time. I wrote a second draft completely set in the borderlands. It was garbage. It was terrible. It was, you know, I was trying to force a round peg into a square hole. And it was 3.5 years into the writing of this novel. It was a moment in 2016 changed everything for me. I started writing this in 2013. So the world, like, I don't even remember what Earth looked like in 2013. It was a very different place, you know, midway through a Barack Obama presidency. But I really was, the book was failing after 3.5 years in. It wasn't working, and I was aware of it, and I was frustrated by it, but I was sort of trapped by my own fear. And then the week before the 2016 presidential election, my mom and dad went out to dinner with a group of friends. My dad was a deacon at St. John Newman's Church in Gaithersburg, Maryland. My mom was a nurse for 40 years at Shady Grove Adventist Hospital in Gaithersburg. And and they were out to dinner in Gaithersburg with a group of friends, and my dad died at the dinner table.
God. Oh.
And he was 71, and he was a real pillar of the community. He was a chaplain at the fire department. He was just beloved, and he was in the prime of his life. And he was my biggest fan. He used to come to my events and bring a sound system with him just in case. He really was so proud of me. And we had talked maybe a week before about this book and how it was not working. And he said to me, keep going. You're onto something important here. And it's a subject that not enough people are paying attention to. Mm-hmm. And then he was gone. Yeah. And I put the book away, and I actually put life away for a few months. And I just sort of sat on the couch in my bathrobe. And then one day, about 3 or 4 months after he died, I dragged my laptop into bed with me, and I wrote the opening scene of American Dirt. And it was the first thing I had written since my dad died. And I didn't know at the time that I was starting over, that I was scrapping the 2 previous drafts. But I think I knew as soon as those 7 pages were down on paper in front of me, that this was the book I had been resisting for 3.5 years, and that it was the book my dad would be proud of. Yeah. And sorry, but in so many ways, that kind of, in so many ways, I think grief can act like a springboard. And in that moment in my life, I was liberated from my fear. I had this brief experience where I honestly did not care what anyone was going to say about this book. I wanted to write the book that I believed in. And a few weeks later, I went to the desert. I rented a casita in the borderlands in Arizona, and I stayed there alone for 8 days, and I wrote almost half the book in 8 days. I had been steeping in the research for 3.5 years. I knew the stories. I knew the feelings that I wanted to engender in the story. And once my sort of resistance fell away, the book just came thundering out of me. I returned home after that trip to the desert, and I finished the book in about, 10 months, 8 or 10 months. Mm-hmm. And that was the book that eventually became American Dirt. And, for better and for worse, it was, I've told that story this year in countless book clubs. I keep waiting for the day I can tell it without crying, and it will happen one day, but it's always painful to go back there. And yet I feel like it's always worth doing in these conversations, because it's so important for me to allow people to understand that this book did not come from entitlement. Mm-hmm. It came from grief and love. And it's a story about the bonds between parents and children, and what we would do to save each other, and the grief that is in the book is my grief.
Jeanine, that's so powerful. And I am sorry to hear about the loss of your father in such a sudden way. Obviously, there's certain things we all go through that make us realize that, other things can't hurt us as much as they might have hurt us once, because we've been through tougher things, much tougher things. I would like to go back to something you said about the research you did. And I'll just tell you, I teach a course at Georgetown. I'm teaching it now on public intellectual writing in America. How do you make tough ideas accessible to a larger audience? And one of the topics that keeps coming up this year in class, this semester, is this idea of who has the authority to write about what, and where does authority come from? And I have a wonderful class this year, but I would say that they are absolutely committed as a class to the idea that authority comes from personal experience, that's the ultimate authority. And I keep arguing with them about other sources of authority. One of the criticisms that was leveled at you was that you did not have the authority to write this book because you haven't yourself been a migrant who's tried to cross the border, because although your grandmother was Puerto Rican, you yourself are not Mexican or Central American. You know, that the authority of identity is not something that you have, and therefore nothing else you did in terms of research. I feel like it was dismissed again as sort of cultural tourism or something, but it wasn't valued at all. And I don't know how you possibly answer that kind of charge, because there's no way you can turn yourself into someone else.
You can't. And actually, one of the more painful elements of this controversy was the fact that it jumped in some strands of criticism from what you have just described into a neighboring box, which was that I was a Latina falsa, that I'm not a real Latina person.
Yeah.
And my ethnicity was also put on trial. And the fact is, I have identified as Latina since I learned the word Latina. And one of the things that happened was that I was quoted from an essay that I wrote I think in 2015 for the New York Times, where I acknowledged my whiteness. I identified myself as white, and that was brought back out as evidence somehow that I am not Latina. And I recently wrote an essay for an anthology where I explored this idea that that these two things are somehow mutually exclusive. I have always identified as white because I am white. And I have always identified as Latina because I consider myself to be Latina. Spanish was my first language. My father spent half of his childhood in Puerto Rico. This was not a distant thing for me. Yeah. In my life, I am Puerto Rican, and I have always considered myself Puerto Rican. And it was a little alarming to me that was up for debate, as if it had some bearing on my capacity to write any novel. Being Puerto Rican does not make me a Mexican migrant or a Central American migrant. So why was that on the table as part of the conversation? Perhaps I opened that door with my ill-advised author's note. But it surprised me. It wasn't something that I expected to be part of the conversation, and it was a very painful element of what happened. Yeah. And it's really nobody's business, because at the end of the day, a novelist can write any novel she wants to write, and I absolutely believe that it's paramount, and I think when you really, really, really begin digging in and having that conversation with people, to be sure there's a generational difference in opinion there. But I think most people believe in the absolute liberty of writers to write any novel, but they will argue on the finer points, and you have to be willing to take it. If you're going to write a novel that crosses cultural boundaries or gender boundaries or strays into a territory that is not your own lived experience, I think you have a responsibility to yourself and to your reader to do so carefully and with tremendous sensitivity, to do the work. And I did.
Yeah. Well, again, I can only speak as a white reader who opened the book and was absolutely drawn in, but a reader who's had a lot of reading experience behind her. I was captivated by the book. It, as I said in my review, it really gave me, it was almost a correlative to this age of anxiety that we've been living through. I felt like I really had a sense with Lydia, the main character, of what it would be like to be in a situation where you had to think on your feet and you never knew what was coming at you from 1 minute to the next. And yet you did it you portrayed that situation in such a way that it didn't feel contrived or cheap. And maybe we should pull back and just acknowledge Lydia's situation. She's a bookseller in Acapulco, and her husband is a journalist who writes some investigative pieces about a drug cartel kingpin who then takes revenge. And these are in the first pages of the novel, so I'm not giving anything away. And her entire family is slaughtered except for her 8-year-old son, Luca. And she and Luca are on the run. And when you talked in your author's note, as you say, your ill-advised author's note, maybe we can get into that, about what you wanted to do in this novel. One of the things that stayed with me was you talked about being a bridge. And again, that statement was criticized. But I think authors can be a bridge, but I also think novels themselves, the form of novels themselves, can be a bridge. I'm a great admirer of suspense fiction, of mystery fiction. I think it's an amazing form to explore a world gone wrong, Raymond Chandler's famous phrase. Mm-hmm. And I feel like part of what you did in this novel was to use some of the conventions of suspense to draw a wide variety of readers in. So thinking of that, I wonder if I could get you to read from the very beginning of the novel, maybe around pages 44 and 45. This Sure. is as Lydia and Luca are in a hotel room. They're on the run. And maybe you can pick it up from there. They've just been given a package delivered to them by room service.
Yes. So Lydia opens the package, and inside she finds a very creepy gift from her friend, her former friend, who is the same person who has just slaughtered her whole family. And the gift is an English language copy of the book Love in the Time of Cholera. And so she opens it, and there's a passage highlighted in the book, and it's the passage where Fermina Daza, the main character, encounters the man Florentino Ariza, whom she rejected 50 years earlier. Fermina, he says, I have waited for this opportunity for more than half a century to repeat to you once again my vow of eternal fidelity and everlasting love, which is super creepy. And then he also includes a card inside, and it's a sympathy card. It's a card with his condolences. And he's written a note that says, Lydia, hay sangre en tus manos también. Lo siento por tu dolor y el mío. Ahora estamos destinados a permanecer eternamente unidos por este pesar. Jamás imaginé este capítulo para nosotros, pero no te preocupes, mi reina del alma. Tu sufrimiento será breve, Javier. There is blood on your hands as well. I'm sorry for your pain and mine. Now we are bound forever in this grief. I never imagined this chapter for us, but do not worry, queen of my soul. Your suffering will be brief. She drops the card and it lands in the toilet, where it darkens at once. Lydia's not sure what she's been expecting when she opened it. There's nothing he could have written there that would make any difference. No quiet slashing of ink on paper can resuscitate her dead mother, her husband. No apology or explanation can reanimate Yennefer's brain, pin her soul back into her body. That girl smelled like grapefruit and sugar, and now she's gone. Lydia beats back a sob using an English word she's never liked, fuck. It works, so she says it again and again. Perhaps she'd hoped the card might illuminate something. She reads it once more, floating, the ink beginning to bleed, and she's haunted by the familiarity of the handwriting. What had she missed? How can this be real? She tries, but she can't force it to make sense, and the effort makes her dizzy. Only one thing is clear. Javier knows where they are. She doesn't have time to panic or reflect. She has to get Luca out of there now. They have to run. She bangs open the bathroom door and hisses at Luca once more to get dressed. He doesn't answer, and when she looks up, she sees that he's already dressed in fresh jeans and his father's red hat, that he's sitting on the chair beside the desk, wriggling his feet into his new socks. Oh, ándale, she says, good. But then he reaches out for the tray of food to cram in a bite before tackling the other sock, and Lydia lunges toward him. She smacks the toast from his hand, and it skids to the floor. Mommy, Luca is shocked. She only shakes her head. Don't eat it. Don't eat any more food. Luca is silent. I don't know if it's safe. She thinks about dragging him into the bathroom and sticking her finger down his throat, but there's no time. She crams all their belongings into her mother's overnight bag and the 2 backpacks. She hasn't even put on her bra yet. No time. Her hair is wet. It's leaving a damp ring around the shoulders of her t-shirt. She jams her bare feet into her mother's quilted sneakers, straps the backpack on herself, and grabs her mother's bag. You ready? Luca nods and picks up the second backpack, the one they bought at Walmart. Super quiet, she says. No noise. Luca seals his mouth. Lydia pauses at the door to lean her ear against the wood and listen before she dares to open it. She pins Luca to the wall beside her and then cracks the door. The hallway is empty, the only sound coming from a television in the room across the hall. She takes Luca's hand and tugs him out, wedging a towel into the door so it won't even click as it closes. They run silently to the service stairs, and when Lydia hears the ding of the elevator at the other end of the hall, she shoves Luca through the door. 7 flights down, Luca flies in front of her. Lydia's feet touch every 3rd or 4th step along the way.
Thank you so much. As you're reading, I feel like readers can hear what you just talked about, the grief that impels this story. And also, I think readers who haven't read the book yet can understand why this book has been such a bestseller. I mean, the fact that it's a phenomenon and people may be curious about the controversy doesn't account for how the staying power of this book. And I think it's actually the quality of the writing, the deft way you structure this story that really accounts for why it's continued to sell, to reach readers, and once people begin it, they don't set it aside. Okay. I'm curious though, why did you make Javier the cartel kingpin? Why you made him a reader? It really seems to be an argument against that belief that I don't know, we liberal progressives want to hold dear, that somehow reading makes us better people. Yeah. This is a man who reads Love in the Time of Cholera, and he's capable of the most heinous crimes.
You know, it's funny to talk about this now in light of the controversy, but I think fundamental to my core goals for this book was that I wanted every character to be crafted away from the stereotype. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we all have Netflix, right? You can turn on Netflix right now and you can find 24 different iterations of stories about violent men in Mexico. Yeah. And they're more or less, they're all very familiar, you know, they're all very similarly crafted characters. And it was important for me that Javier would be a person first, that he wouldn't be defined by his wicked acts and by his profession, I guess. You know, I wanted him to be a human being first. And the same with Lydia and Luca. I wanted them to be people first. I wanted the reader to encounter them first as regular people and then later attach the label to them. Mm-hmm. You know, that typically is the first way people in this country encounter these characters. We encounter them first as migrants. We encounter them in first as narcotraficantes. Mm-hmm. And in this moment, I wanted I wanted them first to be human beings, and, you know, with all kinds of baggage and charm, and in Javier's case, charisma and interesting qualities, before he gets reduced maybe in the reader's mind to just the sum total of his worst qualities, you know. And I suspect that for me as a person and a writer, it came, my desire maybe to do that may have come from another trauma in my life. You know, when my first book was a memoir called A Rip in Heaven, that recounts the story of a horrific tragedy that happened in my family when I was a teenager. And two of my cousins, who were sisters, were raped and murdered by 4 strangers. And my brother was the only surviving victim of that crime. And when I wrote that memoir, I had to do a lot of research wherein I learned about these 4 men, these 4 strangers who did this thing to my family. And it was, you know, really painful to research them and to learn who they were before that night, and to learn how to understand that they were people, that they were someone's sons and someone's brothers. And, you know, I wrote that book when I was really young, and it is a book that I am glad exists, but I acknowledge is deeply flawed. And I couldn't fully explore their humanity in that book because I was blocked by my own anger. But I learned a lot from writing that book and from experiencing that trauma in my life. And I think that probably is always going to show up in the way that I write characters who are not lovely people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that they are multidimensional in some of them.
Yeah.
You know, I think, again, what you said earlier about wanting to flesh out Lydia and Luca and contrast their humanity, their backstory with how people maybe on this side of the border would encounter them. I think when the book ends, Lydia, they're here. They're in this area, Gaithersburg, DC, Silver Spring, and working as house cleaners. I mean, this is how someone like me would encounter someone like Lydia now, but she has this other backstory. And I think that, you know, Lydia herself realizes that she's about to cross a boundary as she's on this journey with Luca, trying to reach the US. It's again, another phrase, that passage that lodges in my head, but I have to read it because I haven't memorized the whole thing. Lydia is thinking on this journey, this desperate journey northward, she says, she and Luca are actual migrants. That is what they are. And that simple fact, among all the other severe new realities of her life, knocks the breath clean out of Lydia's lungs. All her life, she's pitied these poor people. She's wondered with the sort of detached fascination of the comfortable elite how dire the conditions of their lives must be wherever they come from, that this is the better option. I mean, you give, again, someone like me, middle-class white reader, this visceral experience of the ground can disappear under your feet at any moment. And reading your novel at a time in history in this country when it certainly felt, during the Trump presidency, everything else that's been going on, that the pandemic, the ground was disappearing beneath our feet in different ways from day to day. it was almost too frightening to read your book. I mean, I read it right before the pandemic hit, but it's somehow of this moment in that way too, in the anxiety and paranoia.
Yeah. I mean, that was certainly a hope of mine that, I believe in novels, the power of a novel to act as a portal in the reader's life and to take them to a place, to an experience that they may otherwise be tempted to write off or not think very deeply about, or to sort of label as other, and I think novels can be really subversive in that way. They don't need to be obvious,
Yeah.
One of the things that I struggled with in the aftermath of the publication was, given the fact that I wrote 2 full drafts of this book and threw them in the garbage that were both set in, sort of California and Arizona. And then I finally wrote the book set mostly in Mexico. It seems so weird to say it now, but this book never felt to me like a Mexican story.
Mm-hmm.
If I had thought of it in those terms, I don't know if I would have been able to write it, because, the characters happen to be Mexican and Central American largely.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of the whole point of the book is that they could be anyone.
Yeah.
They could be from Syria or Afghanistan or Houston, Texas, or Paradise, California. And what do you do when you're a mother and the place where you live begins to collapse around you and you cannot stay there and your child is in danger? What would you do to save that boy?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the answer crosses every cultural boundary there is.
Yeah.
You would do anything.
Yeah.
You would go to any length. You would jump on top of a train.
Right.
And I've talked to book clubs all year, all over the country, from every different walk of life, from coast to coast, from farmland to cities. And so often people have said to me, I could never do what Lydia did. And I always say, don't let yourself off the hook so easy there, sister, because yes, you could if you had to.
Yeah.
And I want people to consider, like, what if I had to?
Right. Yeah.
That's why I wrote this novel.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, it's about empathy.
Well, I want to connect to Oprah a little bit, and I admired that Oprah stuck to her guns and said, I chose this novel for my book club. I was moved by it. You talk about empathy. I was moved by it. And I'm going to keep it as a book club suggestion, but I want to open out to have this be a conversation with some of the critics of the novel. I think Reina Grande, who gave you a blurb, came on. And I don't know what you thought about it, but Reina wrote, wave my copy here, an op-ed for the New York Times about American Dirt, which I thought was smart and nuanced. She said she blurbed the novel, she gave it an endorsement because she admired a lot of it, a lot of parts of it. She said, when I read American Dirt, I didn't know the backstory. You got a 7-figure advance, the proclamation that this was the immigration book of its time. When I found out it offended and hurt me, I felt undervalued and deceived. The publishing industry had changed its opinion of Mexican immigrant stories, but not until it was someone from outside our community who had written one. And I'll skip down to a couple of paragraphs to the final paragraph. To me, the issue is neither with the book nor its author, but rather with those institutions that silence some voices while elevating others. I thought, as someone who knows something about the publishing industry, I thought that perhaps one positive outcome of all of this, one positive outcome of your conversation with Oprah and some of your critics, is that there is much more of a heightened awareness in the publishing industry of the crucial need for diversity. You wouldn't have been the target so much if the publishing industry were more diverse.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. I appreciated that piece by Reina Grande. I thought it was, as you say, very nuanced in a conversation that otherwise felt very unnuanced at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I worked in the publishing industry for 10 years before I became a full-time writer. And it's true. There is an equity problem. There always has been. The really odd part for me, and not, I mean, just to be real candid here, I grew up in Gaithersburg. My dad was in the Navy. My mom was a nurse. I am a person who happens to be part Puerto Rican. I am from a, you know, not from a privileged background. I went to a state school in Towson in Baltimore. I don't have an MFA. I found myself in the publishing industry very much out of my depth. I bartended for the first 2 years that I worked at Penguin because I could not pay my rent and I don't have a trust fund. And I would make more money in those 2 nights, Friday and Saturday night, than I did all week at Penguin in my job there. And I stuck with it because I loved books and I loved the opportunity of being around book people. And that was where I really, really got my education, was by working in the publishing industry. And it was incredibly surreal for me, you know, and I was aware looking around that many of my colleagues were very different from me in their background. And in their education and in the kind of socioeconomic advantage that they came into the industry with. And it was really, really surreal to suddenly find myself as the poster child for sort of white privilege in publishing, given who I know myself to be. And painful, you know, because that person who they were sort of describing online as Jeanine Cummins was completely unrecognizable to me as a person who has been deeply committed to social justice since I was 16 years old. It was really, really difficult to try to reconcile that sort of distorted public image of what had become of my name with the person who actually wrote American Dirt.
You know, as you're saying all of this, I'm aware of the danger of this medium that we're in, that almost anything you say can be taken online, edited, cut, and put out there and completely distorted. And
and it happened over and over again. And it will continue to happen. So I've sort of given up. I'm like, I'm just going to speak from my heart. I'm going to say what I think, and inevitably someone will take a half a sentence and attribute it to me in some way that it actually means the opposite of what I said.
Right.
And that's part of it. That's part of how we live now in this moment. And you just, as a writer, you have to be committed to your own vision, your own voice. You have to believe that what you're saying has value, and you have to have a really thick skin and you know, be able to accept that whatever I write next, it will happen again, no matter how careful I am. And I have to be okay.
Yeah. Well, I know writers hate this question, but you brought it up. Have you been able to think about what's next? Or are you still in this moment so much?
I'm getting there. I am beginning to cobble together some ideas. It took me a long time because I did feel like I've always endeavored to write stories that would sort of take maybe a familiar tale and turn it on its belly and examine it from a point of view that I felt was sort of historically underrepresented. You know, my first book is shelved in true crime, but it really is a memoir. And it is the story of a true crime from the victim's point of view. My engine as a writer has always been to take the narrative away from the typical narrator and put the people who have actually suffered the trauma in the driver's seat of the narrative. I am much more interested in the stories of the people who survive that trauma or sometimes don't survive the trauma than I am of examining these same stories from the point of view of the man with the gun. Like I just, that's where I live as a writer and as a reader. And because of that, I needed to make sure that I was able to do that before I embarked on a new novel. Like I need to make sure that I'm not going to censor myself, that I'm not going to be writing a different novel because I'm afraid of what people are going to say about it. I want to make sure that I can still speak up. And, you know, it was fascinating. Part of what was fascinating to me this year about the phenomenon of American Dirt coinciding with this current wave of racial reckoning in our country is that I see for the first time people being engaged in conversations about social justice, people who have never cared before, people who haven't really been paying attention, who are now finally saying, like, maybe I do have a role to play here. And I am a person who believes that we need every voice at the table. Everyone who has something to say, who has the capacity to shine their light on injustice. I think that's a thing worth doing.
Yeah.
But this is part of what we need to figure out culturally right now. Are white people supposed to sit down and be quiet and get out of the way? Or are we supposed to stand up for our brothers and sisters of color when we see an injustice and lend our voice to the fight and shine our light on that injustice? And the thing is, I see a lot of people who are so eager to get it right and they don't want to do it wrong and they're afraid. And so very often they just turn to the nearest person of color and they say, tell me what to think.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, that's not fair. And also, there's no consensus. If you ask 10 different people of color, you're going to get 10 different answers. So you have to do the work of moral investigation yourself. You have to decide individually, this is how I feel about it. If I see an injustice in my community, I'm going to stand up and point it out, or it's not my place. And it's your own moral compass that has to be your guide in that endeavor. And as a writer, I've been clear on this point for many years. And I needed to make sure before I move on to the next book that I'm still clear on this point. And I think I am. I know who I am. I know what my voice is capable of. I know that there are people who don't want me at the table. And I understand that, and I respect it. And I feel that it is, it's a difficult line, but I want to be part of the fight. I want to be in this fight. I want to remain in this fight. I've been in this fight my whole life. And I think it's an important fight to be part of.
I think, I certainly see everything that you're talking about in microcosm in the classroom. People, students wanting to do the right thing, to be engaged and not quite knowing, whether they should speak, whether they should just sit back, especially white students, and listen, like how to get involved in difficult conversations about race and racial justice.
And the thing that you said about publishing is such an important part of this conversation too, because often I think the fact that certain voices are elevated above other voices is a very significant, like a fulcrum point in this problem, right? It's a very significant part of the problem. because when I wrote American Dirt, it was my hope that I would contribute my voice to the chorus of voices that should all be calling out this injustice. We should be paying attention to these stories at our southern border. We are part of the reason they exist. We need to be part of the solution. And the first thing is we need to have empathy, and we need to be engaged, right? I never wanted my voice to be elevated above all the other voices. I never intended for my book to be the book, you know. It's a novel, it's a story, it's one effort to engage people in thinking about this issue that I care very deeply about. And elevating certain voices and ignoring other voices is a real problem. And maybe that's part of where we can go in a really practical way on how to solve these problems.
Certainly the awareness is there. Now we have to, I guess, wait and see if there's real change in terms of who's at those tables.
I see it. I'm hopeful. I bet you see it. I don't know how.
I see it in the books that I'm getting. I see a greater diversity of authors.
There is a greater diversity within the publishing houses too. They've all been making real strides this year because of this. So I am hopeful that there will be a more, when you have more diverse gatekeepers, you have more diverse voices coming out. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see that.
Well, I want to end, unfortunately, this conversation, Jeanine, because I really, really have enjoyed talking to you, and not that it should be unexpected, but you're so deeply thoughtful about your own place, about the place of this book, and given what you've been through, I think so understanding and frankly generous to people who sometimes have, thought the worst of you or ascribed the worst intentions to you, without even having read the book. I mean, that always surprised me when I would get into conversations with people, even some of my colleagues, and they'd begin talking about American Dirt, and I'd say, "Did you read it?" "No, I haven't read it." So it's really been such a pleasure to talk with you. But I wanted to end by bringing you back home to this book festival and to your original home, to Gaithersburg. Was this where it started? Was this where your love of reading, your idea of I want to be a writer one of these days? Were you nurtured by the Gaithersburg Public Library, or
yes?
How did it begin?
Yeah, it's, I was actually born in Spain, and then I lived in California when I was little. But we moved to Gaithersburg when I was, starting kindergarten. So I was really young. And then I went to South Lake Elementary School, and I got a great education in the Montgomery County Public School system. I didn't realize at the time how unusual my childhood was. And something I always talk about with my friends when I go back to Gaithersburg is we lived in this, I don't know if it was the time, because I don't think it's still quite exactly the same, but my neighborhood was incredibly diverse, but also integrated, that was the part that I didn't realize how unusual that was. And we had wonderful teachers. And so it was this real idyllic kind of childhood. And it wasn't until I left Gaithersburg and I went to college that I began to appreciate how rare and precious my upbringing was. But, I always dreamed of being a writer. I wrote my first book when I was like 7, and it was about a little girl who skateboards across the United States. She's, it was a real masterpiece. But, I always dreamed of it, but I didn't have any sense in my life that it was a thing that people could do. Everyone in my life was not an artist. And it was a wonderful surprise when I finally made it to the publishing world. And I was like, oh, people are writing books and they're doing that as their job. And it's a real thing that people can do. And so Gaithersburg was a really great launching pad, I think, for me in so many ways. And I look back really fondly at my childhood there. It was a beautiful place to grow up.
Well, I'm glad we could bring you back, at least virtually. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
I have to say there were moments during this conversation where I was welling up, but to end on such a ringing endorsement of our community is particularly meaningful. So thank you for that. Thank you for the question, Maureen, and Jeanine, for your lovely answer. On behalf of our Gaithersburg community and book lovers everywhere, I want to thank you guys for giving us just a brilliant, deeply personal, meaningful, spectacular conversation. This has been a great program, and Jeanine Cummins and Maureen Corrigan, it has been an honor to host you once again. I hope we'll have you back for your next work. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Judd. I really enjoyed the conversation, Maureen. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss any of it. So please go to Gaithersburgbookfestival.org and look over our schedule so you can plan the rest of your festival month. Before you go, we have a special message for you from the amazing author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett, and her dog, Sparky. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog, Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.